Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, Mark Rockwell, staff writer at FCW.
I'm Adam Mazmanian, the executive editor of FCW, and I hope I can follow Mark. I heard he did a great job. And before we start, I'm going to do a few housekeeping announcements. First, please silence your cell phones. Second, I'm happy to announce that attendees of this plenary session will be eligible to receive a continuing professional education credit for their participation. Just make sure your badge was scanned. We're going to save time for a question and answer at the end, so please hold your questions until then. And now, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. Okay. So just to get started, on my immediate left is Rob Klopp. He's the CIO of the Social Security Administration. After that is Jason Martin, Services Directorate Executive at DISA, at the Defense Systems Information Agency. And all the way at the end is Richard McKinney. He's the Chief Information Officer of the Department of Transportation. And just before we get started, I just want to kind of frame up the topic for a moment. We're talking about legacy IT, and the theme is keep it or kick it. And I think if the question were that easy, we could just say kick it, and then we could go have lunch or something. But it's not that easy. Everyday operations in government are supported by applications written decades ago in computer languages that are not part of the Young Engineers Toolkit. These operations are required by law. They can't just go offline for a few weeks or months while IT guys figure it out. Agencies recently reported to a House committee that the government employs more than 3,400 IT specialists to maintain legacy code in languages like COBOL and Fortran. Now, it so happens that a lot of these legacy systems are stable and do precisely what they're intended to do, but the problem is cost. It's said that more than 75% of the overall IT spend, that's almost $90 billion, 75% of $90 billion goes to operations and maintenance. And the systems that are coming up, the cloud-based, the virtual systems, they just cost less. And agencies want to get there. So just sort of to get started, I want to start with Rob and get your thoughts.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a couple things I'll sort of start off by saying. One is, we spend a lot of time talking about legacy IT and the costs as if that's really the only driver. But I think that there's another thing that's even more significant, and that is that at SSA, for example, we still run 60 million lines of COBOL code in production and about 7 million lines of assembler. And these are systems that send checks out that represent 5% of the US GDP. So, it's a significant job. But the thing that scares me isn't the cost. The cost is worrisome. What scares me is that these systems that were built 30 years ago were built by staff that still work for the most part at SSA. And I recently pulled the numbers and discovered that 37% of all of the IT staff at SSA will be eligible to retire within the next 5 years, 37%. So the issue isn't just that we have these systems that are expensive to run, but it's that the staff that built them, that understands the old legacy programming languages and environment and stack, those people are all going to be leaving. And so it's not just that we need to modernize in order to make our systems more secure, or that we need to modernize in order to reduce the cost of running government. I really think that there's almost an existential problem if we let these people retire and we can no longer maintain the systems, so we've got a much bigger problem. Sort of the second thing that I'd like to sort of queue up for you guys is the idea of what a modern system is, because we talk about modernization, and there are projects that were underway when I first came to SSA 18 months ago that were taking giant monolithic globs of COBOL and rewriting them into giant monolithic globs of Java that would still run on the mainframe. And there's people that call that modernization. And I suppose you could argue that going from a Model T to a 54 Chevy is modernization, but it's probably not really what we had in mind. So I think I'm going to just sort of leave you with the thought of imagining, ask yourselves what you think the target of modernization ought to be. What I would argue is that the target of modernization needs to be extremely scalable software applications that can run on a very large cluster of commodity hardware, i.e. in the cloud, and elastically expand and contract to take advantage of that cloud infrastructure. It's not just rewriting to Java. In fact, I would argue it's not about the programming language at all. It's everything about architecture.
Okay. And I want to move over to Jason, and let me just introduce you a little bit more fully. Jason's responsible for the optimal and rapid delivery solutions for mission-critical enterprise and tactical systems across warfighter, business, and intelligence mission areas, leveraging the enterprise user vision. And he implements and sustains enterprise applications in the DISA service catalog. So not quite as clear as CIO of this agency, but I wanted to sort of spell it out a little bit for folks.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Adam. As some of you likely know, the DoD has very similar challenges to the Social Security Administration. Very large organization. DISA's role is providing infrastructure for the department. So for those of you who don't know, DISA provides all the classified and unclassified networks for the global network, the Global Defense Network. We also provide, specifically in my organization, enterprise services that run, for example, DoD Enterprise Email, Enterprise Portal Service, collaboration services for the department. In addition to that, we also provide all the IT processing data centers at the enterprise level. So we've got presently 10 data centers today that house any and everything you can imagine from 1960 to current day from a hardware and software perspective. So to Rob's point about the code itself, we bring in the code from other organizations. We bring in other COTS products, other GOTS products, and we have to find out how best to host that. So it's interesting for us, rather than develop a capability holistically from the beginning or from the onset, we as an infrastructure service provider are the recipient of what's being developed out in commercial space. So the keys to us and to upgrading either the environment or moving from a legacy to a new environment is to get involved early. So what we're finding is as COCOM services and agencies come to us with capabilities that have already been developed, it's much harder to retrofit what they need than if they would have come to us in the beginning. So as we try to enforce standardization, in our terms, what we'd like to get to is a brutal standardization. Sometimes it's simply very difficult based on the life cycle at which we're approached. So what we've really tried to do is come up with an outreach campaign and really start to work across the department to identify what standards are, what commercial technology is offering, what we're kind of seeing in the marketplace, and then working with our mission partners to ensure that we do get the newest technology in the data centers. We've achieved a great deal of efficiency when it comes to modernization with virtualization. About 10 years ago, when we awarded the initial capacity services contracts, we had about 5% virtualization. Today, across our data centers, all 10, across 15,000 servers, we're at about 75% virtualization. So there's a big win for us that we've accomplished in the past 10 years, just working with people, identifying and leveraging new technologies, and then being able to bring them in a relatively easy manner and or transition from a legacy state to the future IT. So from our perspective, the key is working early, engaging early, working collaboratively, and then engaging with mission partners and industry to ensure that we have the latest and greatest technology coming into our data centers besides what we're leveraging there today and continually upgrading in the sustainment mode.
Okay. Thanks very much. And Richard, I want to just say Richard's been the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Transportation for about 3 years. Is that right? 3 years now. And was a CIO in Tennessee in Nashville before that. So take it away.
All right, well, thank you. It's nice to be with you all today. I got a chuckle when I was looking at the agenda today and it said IT legacy, keep it or kick it. And I thought, if I thought going downstairs and kicking it would help, I'd buy a pair of steel-toed boots and I'd go downstairs and kick it. But in all seriousness, you know, there's a lot of our IT that is legacy. It starts with the network and it comes up onto the platforms and through the applications. As many of you probably know, FAA is a part of the Department of Transportation, and there's an enormous modernization effort going on in the national airspace that's called Next Gen. that will forever change the way that the national airspace is managed, will totally change the way that airplanes stay in constant communication with the ground and transmit data back and forth. I think that, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the days of hunting for the black box may come to an end as a result of all this, that the plane will be constantly talking to the ground. And so there's an enormous modernization effort going there that's probably, I've seen schedules that go out 15, 20 years. In the rest of the department, in sort of your traditional IT, legacy IT, we have, I certainly don't have the kind of, I don't say grace over the kind of world that Rob's with the large mainframes and 5% of the nation's economy running through it. But so I always like listening to Rob talk about it because he understands that so well. But we do have a legacy IT, and like I said, it starts with our network. And as I and my team have tried to tackle the challenges around cybersecurity, one of the things that's become abundantly clear, and one of the things that the entire federal CI community, led by Tony Scott, have been having a conversation around, is that we're not going to patch our way out of our legacy issues. That we're going to have to, cyber's going to have, we're going to have to reinvent a lot of this, and we're going to have the cyber portion of it architected into it from the get-go, and not something that we bolt on later. So there's a big effort going on in my department to identify all of that legacy IT. We've been reporting that up to O&B, and we're looking forward to the day when the IT Modernization Fund passes Congress, and we have a body of folks that we can get in front of with some of the ideas we have about how we can replace some of our legacy IT.
Well, let me stick with you for a sec, since you're talking about identifying systems to modernize. What's the process? How do you do that, and how do you deal with perhaps the competing stakeholders? If you're, I guess, at a large agency, maybe that's more relevant, but how does that work?
Well, I mean, it's not hard to identify it. I mean, one, you can look at it from its age. A lot of it is we look at the data. Where's the data? Where's the important data? One of the things that we hear from the security community all the time is, perimeter defense and good cyber hygiene is very, very important. But what you really have to do is figure out where your important data is. Where are your jewels, and you've got to figure out how to protect and guard those. So a lot of our identifying our high value assets and our legacy IT is we follow and follow that prescription, and we're engaged in that process right now.
And Rob, you talked a little bit about moving from a Model T to a 1950s automobile. For people who are being asked to kind of leapfrog through several generations of technology from where they are to where they could be in a few years, I imagine there's sort of I imagine it's a little scary. There's some cultural issues. How do you address that?
It's interesting. I would say when I first started at SASA about 18 months ago, I was probably more concerned about these cultural things than anything else. I was worried that the agency would be very resistant to change. And I don't find that at all. In fact, the reality is that programmers are geeks, whether they program in COBOL or they program in Node.js or Erlang, right? And what I found was that when I came to these folks and said, look, there's a new way of doing things, and you probably missed a couple of generations, and let's just skip right to a modern way of doing things. I found that the excitement was palpable. I mean, these people were really excited about it. So, don't get me wrong, there are certain people that were resistant, and there are people that were afraid and scared, and there are some set of people that really don't want to move to the new thing, but that's okay because the old stuff's going to be around for a while. But in general, I think that all of this talk about culture being a gigantic barrier to moving forward is really, kind of a bunch of fluff. I think that if you give people the right tools and you give them the right modern environment to go work in, and you give them permission to go act like they work in Silicon Valley instead of in the Beltway, that basically you're going to get the same kind of work out of them that people get out of people in Silicon Valley.
And I want to put that same question to you, Jason, because you deal with a host of different organizations that are in different processes of modernization and maybe a little bit stovepiped and not dealing with each other across. Right. So you may have another picture of that. Can you share with us?
Right. So as everybody knows, Defense Department's taking cuts. We are the recipient of those cuts traditionally, and so are all the program managers. So the big key for us is, as we look at legacy or new technology or a hybrid or cloud type capability, it becomes a business decision for us. So we also have quite a few mainframes. DISA doesn't personally leverage them, but we provide them to some of the larger services. What really makes sense? Does it make sense to take that 30-year-old financial application that's been upgraded over the years? It is a very current application from a patching perspective, security perspective, technology, software perspective, that's kind of followed through the times with the software vendors as they've continued to upgrade mainframe software. But does it really make sense to take them and put them into a very large server farm? Sometimes budgets dictate that, sometimes budgets allow that, and sometimes they don't. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today. What we've done to help upgrade that environment, for example, is we invested in integrated facilities for Linux on the mainframe. So we've helped our largest customers kind of modernize from that perspective. So coming off the COBOL side, but being able to run virtualized type environments in the mainframe environment with the processing power behind them you may not get on some of the smaller server environments. But across the board, whether we're talking about cloud again, or mainframes, or Linux, Unix, Windows, etc., it becomes business. So there are legacy Windows systems out there today. What really makes sense for that application owner, based on the cuts that they're receiving, based on the strategic direction they're trying to go, and how can we best get them there?
Richard, you want to?
Yeah, I want to double down on what Rob says about the cultural thing. I found the same thing, which is I think the technical community, they like the new car too. They like the new tools. They like the idea of going to the cloud. If there's any cultural resistance, it's more at the programmatic level of people who think it's always work, why mess with it? But the technical folks get it, and if you can actually appeal to them and show them, hey, we could go off and do some exciting stuff, and get them on your side, that helps a lot with if there is any cultural resistance. The geeks can help you quite a bit.
Well, that's a great segue to the next question, because Rob, I've heard you talk before about how it's not just modernizing your IT. If you're going to upgrade, you've got to upgrade your business processes, so you're not just sort of lifting and shifting the way you do the work into a new system. And how do you get the C-suite people on board for that piece?
So I guess I'd sort of say two things about that. One is, if you could picture in your mind the technology curve that's your agency's ability to adopt technology, and you picture in your mind the technology curve itself, and you decided that you were going to start to try to incrementally modernize your world, I think what you'd find is the speed that you could incrementally modernize, no matter how fast and good you got at it, would never be as fast as the technology curve. And so the reality is, if you spent 5 years modernizing a system, what you'd find is you've actually lost ground on technology in general. So I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that you probably can't win that race. The reason that companies like Netflix and even Apple to some extent, and certainly Google, explode into markets is because they don't try to move into a market from a legacy position. They just jump straight onto the technology curve. And I think that what we need to start thinking about is not taking our old legacy systems and incrementally modernizing them. I think we need to think about replacing them and jumping straight onto the technology curve. And I think that leads me really to the more direct answer to your question, which is, if we're going to rewrite these systems in a modern way to be scalable and use the cloud and all of those things that I started off suggesting was the definition of a modern application. I think it behooves us to go back to the business and ask them to rethink their business processes. At Social Security, we're an 80-year-old agency that started off with big data before there was even such a thing as big data. In fact, the reason the Social Security Administration is in Baltimore instead of in the Beltway is because they realized that we were going to have so much paper on all of the citizens that there wasn't any space down here to store that much paper. So what we've done is we've taken a business process that's 80 years old that was paper-based, and in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, rebuilt the same business process, the same 80-year-old business process, only we put electronic forms in front of them, and we thought that that was pretty cool. And now we think the definition of cool is to replace CICS green screens with HTML5 GUI screens. And it's the same 80-year-old business process, it's just the electronic forms are getting maybe a little bit more intelligent as we go. I think that we need to think harder about new business processes, and I think it's, at least at SSA, and I think in lots of places, that it's going to be catalyzed by systems and IT expressing to the business the kind of opportunities that new technology affords them to use machine learning and other kinds of advanced analytic techniques to fundamentally change the way we engage the citizen who is our customer when we go do this stuff.
And I wanted to leapfrog over to Richard for your thoughts on that.
Rob, he totally nailed that. I can tell by my gray hair, I began my career many years ago. I was working for the state of Tennessee, and I was a developer. And this was the point.
I could beat you. I started out at California, state of California, as a tabulating machine operator.
Oh, God. All right. But anyway, I remember what was going on back then was I would go into an office and we would just capture the paper process. We would sort of document the paper process, and we would code to mirror the way things had always been done. And there's a gentleman, I think his name's Michael Hammer, if I got that right, that referred to that as paving the cow path, and I paved a lot of cow paths. And Rob's right. With all this cloud and all this stuff, all these new tools before us, we need to resist the temptation to try to pick up those old processes and just recreate them. We need to figure out how, as Rob said, how we leapfrog that and really rethink the whole business process.
Now, Jason, I was saving you for last on this one because you're doing service delivery for customers. You may have some ideas on how they can improve their business processes, but maybe they don't want to hear them. So I wanted to get your perspective from that point of view.
Agree. Sometimes they don't want to hear them. What we've done at DISA is specifically we've awarded capacity-based and computing on-demand contracts to be able to provide whatever, whenever. So what we do is publish those reference architectures. We publish things outwardly. We do strategic engagement to say, hey, here's the art of the possible, work with us. So we make sure that we get that word out quickly to say, here's all the various technologies, here's what you have today, here's some optimization type sessions or suggestions that we have, and we'll also bring in our business partners and industry experts to say, have you thought about this? Here's what we're doing with company A over here in this space for big data analytics. Here's what we're doing for cyber defense. Here's what we're doing from an enterprise service perspective. And we will physically bring our industry partners to the table with them to give them ideas. Sometimes it pans out, sometimes it doesn't. But at least we've tried to, in the beginning, do that partnership to say, here's what we believe to be industry best practices, here's what we believe to be industry standards, and here's where, based on what we're hearing out of the DoD CIO or other parts of the department, here's where we think we're going. So again, it's engaging, it's bringing more of a community-based type approach. And again, like you say, they may not want to hear it, but then we do change quite a few minds. We do a lot of things, we get a lot of things at the 11th hour, but then we do come in and say, hey, did you think about doing it this way with this certain set of standards? Sometimes they will adopt, sometimes they do come in, allows us to further virtualize, allows us to consolidate workloads at times, which is something that we're also doing in the ERP space. If I could briefly talk about, we've got significant challenges across the Department of Defense with enterprise resource planning systems. Multiple logistics, financial, systems across the department that we are now working with them collectively. We sit down with each one of the PEOs or program executive offices to say, here's the current capability, here's our strategic vision for leveraging a new set of middleware, infrastructure, common reporting, common analysis, common metrics, that we can all come on board. If we can come back and standardize an overall platform, big win for the Department of Defense, big win for the department, big win for taxpayers, and that's exactly where we're trying to go.
Okay. And I wanted to ask all three of you, one of the big modernization traps in government is the way you're funded. You get a certain amount of money, you've got to keep your systems running and plan for the future. And maybe Richard, I'll start with you. What are the challenges there, and you mentioned the modernization fund. Is that potentially an answer?
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm looking forward, and I really, believe what Tony's proposing and what I.
Do you want to just give a quick précis of what it is?
I'll do my best. There's the administration has asked Congress for $3.2 billion to be put into IT modernization fund, and that fund will be administered by a board of experts, and then a CIO like myself can come to that board and make a case. I've got this old system. Here's how I would replace it. Here's what that replacement would cost. Here's what that replacement could save, and out of that, then I should be able to say, and here's how I can pay the fund back. The fund is designed to be self-perpetuating. It's not a grant machine. It's a bank, and you got to pay the bank back. And but as a CIO, I look forward to being able to make that case about a system and its replacement and the ROI to a body of folks who are in that business and understand it and can say, yeah, I think that'd work. That probably won't work. You need to change that here. If you could change that, we would approve it. Having that kind of a conversation with at a budget level, with appropriators, and I'm not knocking appropriators, but being able to make your pitch to people who have lived in your shoes and understand, understand what you're saying. I think that it shows a great deal of promise, and I'm confident that we're going to be able to get Congress. If they're really serious about getting legacy out, and I see, I'm not a political, wizard or anything, but watching what's going on, I see them starting to go, this makes sense. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to get this through.
Okay. Rob, you want to?
Sure. So, I couldn't be more supportive of the President's IT modernization fund, and I would suggest all of you write your congressman, because it's really important. I mean, Jason mentioned earlier that for him these things become economic and there has to be a business case. But the problem is when you live in a government world with an annual budget, business cases are only 12 months long. You don't really get long-term investment.
That's right.
And so the problem is that you're constantly making short-term decisions that create technical debt. My guess is that Jason often gets confronted with situations where he knows that there's a long-term direction that he ought to be on, but the short-term economic decision might be to just pave the cow pasture a little bit, right? And it's this IT modernization fund that allows us to take a long-term look at trying to retire the technical debt that we've accrued over 30 years. And it's really, that's what we have to do. We have to have the money to keep the systems running and going, and maybe even slightly upgrade them in order to keep 5% of the GDP going while we go spend the money to go modernize. I think the last thing I'll leave you with on this thing is the cost of modernization probably isn't what you think if we do it in a modern way. I mean, if you go look at the numbers of what a company like Facebook spent to build an application that supported 1 billion concurrent users at the time that they went public, you'd be shocked because it's less than $100 million. In Silicon Valley, there's no such thing as a $100 million software startup. There's no such thing. And so there's something just fundamentally wrong with thinking about these modernization things of government as being billion-dollar initiatives. They're not. They're a series of $50 million initiatives or $25 million initiatives if we just go do it smart instead of doing it the way we've been doing it for the last 20 years with the same people that we've been doing it with for the last 20 years that for their own reasons want everything to be a billion-dollar project.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, you can, if you're doing a large legacy project, you're talking about picking it off in stages in a more agile kind of way. In government, can you field the results of that kind of incrementally and get those services out to people, or do you have to wait until you retire an old system to kind of take the wraps off a new one?
So it's really interesting. We're actually in the middle of a project now that's probably 150 technical people on an agile project, which not only might well be the biggest agile project, certainly one of the biggest in government, but it might actually be one of the biggest anywhere. I mean, there's lots of talk that agile doesn't work for large projects, and we're not finding that to be the case at all. But there's an interesting sort of meme, something you have to get your heads wrapped around that's probably even more important than agile, and that is the concept of a product instead of a project. Right? When we build something as a project, we build it, we go, I'm done with that, and we put it in maintenance mode. And the day we put it in maintenance mode, it starts accruing technical debt because we're not keeping it going. If you're a software company and you build a product, you go charge your customer 20% of the original purchase price, and you continue to maintain and upgrade it all the time, continuously. And that's really what Agile is. Go to the backlog, pick out the next set of most important user stories and go move on and just keep going until the backlog completely dries up and nobody's got any more stories anymore. So, we talk a lot about Agile, but I think that a more important concept is for us to think about these things not as projects, but as products that we constantly improve and constantly upgrade and constantly adjust to take advantage of the next bit of technology that's come along. And if we did that, technical debt would not accrue, and we would be constantly providing modern Uber-like interfaces to our citizens to go work with the government.
Just to follow up on that, it sounds like you might be saying that the way CIOs are forced to do accounting between their operations and maintenance and their development is kind of a legacy construct.
I think it is a legacy construct.
It absolutely is.
The whole way we account for it is really weird. In fact, I actually had a discussion yesterday where people were talking about the fact that when we're in maintenance mode, we actually make functional improvements to applications. Well, that's not maintenance by any normal definition. Maintenance is just what you do to kind of keep it barely running, and functional enhancements are actually development. So we actually just account for it a little bit weird too.
Now this $3.1 million project, the proposal, one of the things, it's sort of part of a larger cybersecurity effort. And I wanted to just direct this one to you, Jason. When you're talking about modernization, how important is cybersecurity to get the attention of business leaders?
So it's becoming DISA's number one. Now that General Lin, our director, is responsible for not only DISA but the Joint Forces Headquarters, Doden, very important to us. So I spend at least, I would say, half of my day discussing cyber topics, whether it's vulnerability management, it's proactively planning, it's talking about moving, to your point, Richard, about perimeter controls to data controls. So every single day, I would tell you that at least half of my day is spent on cyber analysis, cyber planning, cyber budgeting, et cetera. So, and it's all the way from the perimeter to the data that exists within DISA's own applications and or the customers that we support their applications. So first and foremost on our mind is cyber, especially with our standing within the Department of Defense and who we engage with, Cyber Command, et cetera. But very important, we bake that in early. So again, more reference architecture, more standardized infrastructure information we provide out to the department early on so they can bake that into their contracts. And then we continue to the day that they turn up those systems. We make sure that every single box is checked, validate every single thing that has been done appropriately, and then we turn it up, and then we're in the constant maintenance mode and or monitoring mode and review and update mode. So every day, very important to us.
And I want to just follow up with you, Richard, on that. Is this sort of cybersecurity crisis that we're facing kind of an opportunity for the CIO community?
Absolutely. You know, I was in a meeting this morning, spent most of the morning. We've been going over some network architecture issues, and there's some serious cyber issues that we're addressing. And when you're able to have that conversation with the leadership and show them that, you know, here's what we need to do in order to, you know, address this issue. You know, people pay attention to you when you talk about cyber. I mean, it's on everybody's mind. You can't pick up the paper without talking about it. So it's one of those issues. You know, you don't want to. It's not like you're crying wolf. It's just saying, you know, there but for the grace of God go us if we don't make these investments.
You want to follow up on that, Rob?
Yeah, so I would say that for CIOs, cyber is a fantastic opportunity to be blasted by your critics. The reality is that you can't win. You know, everybody is somewhat vulnerable. You have to be gigantically paranoid in a world where you're vulnerable, and the people. In one breath will expect you to be paranoid, and in the next breath will ask you to give them some assurances that you're protecting their data. And the fact is that if you give them assurances, they think you're not paranoid enough, and if you are too paranoid, then they want to be assured, and so it's just sort of, you know, a lose-lose. But I don't think that's really the question you asked. So what I would say is that it is an opportunity for CIOs, because you can go back and say, look, I have this old legacy system. All of the new modern tools that are being developed at a very rapid pace by the commercial world in order to assist us in defending against cyber attack and in detecting cyber attack when it goes on, all of those tools are being built for the new modern world. They're not being built for the old world, because the companies that build them know where the future is, right? So if you have an old legacy mainframe system, despite some of the stuff that they might claim otherwise, it's actually it is somewhat less secure, because it doesn't have all of the cyber defensive stuff around it that you can put around legacy systems, I think. So the opportunity is there to go get the funding to make the leapfrog and do all the stuff we're talking about up here on this panel, and sort of use cyber as a you know, a bugaboo to make the money come.
And I just wanted to tack this question on the sort of the data piece here. This administration has been very big on building high-value data sets from government data to go to the private sector. And when you're doing modernization, I wanted to ask, is building high-value data sets something you think about, you know, interoperable, usable data, something you think about when you go into a project like that? We can start with you, Rob, I guess.
Sure. So I think that when you think about modernization, and you're going to rebuild applications, you have to think about where are the sort of common leverage points, and data is that common leverage point. So I would argue that the very first thing that you should start off doing is try to modernize your data architecture. And what that means today in a modern world is that you have an architecture where the data is sort of enterprise-wide and subject-oriented and highly integrated, as opposed to the stovepipes that we've been building for so many years. The second thing I think that is part of a modern data architecture is there's sort of two flavors. So you replicate the data. One flavor of the data is used to do online transaction processing and to kind of record transactions. And the other flavor of data is to transform the data so that you can do historical analytic processing. There really isn't yet an architecture. In fact, there's actually a thing called the CAP theorem that would suggest that there is no architecture that allows you to do highly scalable transaction processing and highly scalable analytics against the same data. So your data architecture, where you need to start, is to modernize that stuff and build it in a way that you can get both OLTP and analytics against and have it sort of be a natural outgrowth of your modern system, as opposed to a data warehouse that's tacked on at the end.
Richard, you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, our whole IT, the thing of value is the data. That's the value. The rest of the infrastructure is just how that lifeblood moves from point A to point B, and where you store it and how you analyze it, and the data is what's valuable. And so I want to echo what Rob said. Data standards, and one of the things that we're doing is I hired a chief data officer, and we've done an exhaustive inventory of all the data in the department, trying to figure out what we have and what's of value, and how are we storing it, how are we protecting it, because if you stripped away all the metal and wires and everything, what remains and what's of value is the data itself.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, at DoD, maybe open data isn't the thing, but interoperability across services, across systems, from your position, is that something where you are kind of have to act as the conductor when you're doing modernization?
So we do. It depends on the capability itself and the data to be shared. So yes, we facilitate a lot of discussions between the logistics community, the financial communities, the tactical communities. Some of the data simply doesn't make sense to share, even though it may be standard, it may be common. For example, building access. Should we share that data across the department? Probably not. Very specific requirements at Fort Meade versus an Air Force installation, for example. But what we do at DISA specifically, we co-chair a working group at the department level with the IC, data standards, metadata, data tagging. We work collectively across the department and within the IC to ensure that we are sharing, we're setting standards, tagging the data, and then ensuring that that is widely advertised so people can consume, leverage, share, et cetera. So from a department level perspective, we do that. When we get a specific workload that'll come in, for example, we say, hey, did you think about contacting these folks, be it in the same organization or not? And we'll make those connections as well. Say, have you thought about consuming this data? Have you been exposed to this? Are you exposing this data that these other folks may be able to use? So we do help facilitate some of that, but within the department, there are obviously different requirements, different funding streams, different program objectives that they need to meet, but we certainly try to facilitate where possible. And then at the department level, we do that.
Great. Well, we've used up a bit of time. People have been very nice to listen, but I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience. We've got some mics set up, I think. Is there one right over there? And there's one, I think, over there as well. But please go ahead. And please identify yourself and affiliation if you care to.
Cynthia Hilsinger with Regional Health Command, Atlantic. It's Army Medical, so we're dealing with a lot of data. My question is, especially for Mr. Jason Martin at DISA, we have difficulty in getting modern software because the first thing that happens is they check, does it have a certificate of networthiness? And when we don't have a certificate of networthiness, a CON, we can't put it on our systems. And of course, what I want to buy is the brand new version of software, which doesn't have a CON. But we can get an older version that has gone through that process. How do we deal with that?
So we get this question a lot, as you might imagine. The DoD, we talk about cyber, we talk about security. Obviously, we're going to be very careful when evaluating various software products. So as I've mentioned a few times, and I'll start to sound like a broken record, engage early, engage often. So again, with our outreach, what we try to do is do outreach forums, we do forecast industry, we do our cyber symposium, and then we have the IASC website that you can go to identify where we are. I think you can submit requests to there. And then we have DISA has established a new cyber directorate to be able to deal specifically with this, with hopes of becoming more agile, with taking the various components from across the agency, pulling them into a single directorate within the agency. And then that, though we all engage with other parts of the department and the IC, they are specifically focused on doing that. And then also working with our partners in DoD CIO, Mr. Richard Hale's organization. So in terms of expediting, it's us again engaging industry. It's our mission partners telling us, hey, here's what we need. Here's where we see the marketplace going. Here's what we'd like you to evaluate. And then getting it into that approval or review stream.
I just want to add, it's a really interesting question. Because if you think about my sort of mental image earlier of the technology adoption curve, the fact is that new technology is basically coming available at a rate that's faster than anybody can keep up with it, including these guys, right? Including the FedRAMP people, including everybody. And so the reality is that I think that we have to change the way we evaluate this stuff, and we're going to have to find a way to do it faster. And I'm not exactly sure what that is, but in a world where new technology shows up, dozens and hundreds of really effective, important products, a year, we can't think that the processes that we used 20 years ago in order to certify stuff are against that. Those processes are just not going to hold up. But I will tell you, I'm not sure what the new process is. I just know that it's, that there's just something fundamental we're going to have to figure out how to do differently.
So we are trying. So I was in a meeting with the director last week, talking about a number of other things at the CIO level, talking about the need to evaluate things differently, to look at things differently, providing our recommendations to CIO. Ultimately, they're the decision authority. I know that John Hickey's organization spends every day of the week with them working through exactly these challenges, process changes, approval challenges, review challenges, and it's simply getting buy-in, I think, from across the department, working collectively across the department, say, hey, does this really make sense? Are we looking at things the way we did 20 years ago? The answer is undoubtedly yes, in some cases. In other cases, it's not. So it's getting the right people in the room, the right decision makers in the room, getting them on the same page, and that's, again, working with some of the other folks across the government to do that. But I'll absolutely tell you, we are trying, and the department is trying to do that.
Okay, question over here.
Hey, I'm Zach Noble. I write for FCW. Thanks all for taking the time. This is primarily for Rob. You talked about jumping straight onto the technology curve, but you also talked, and many other CIOs have talked about the need to do incremental development on really complex systems, especially ones like yours or IRS with a lot of complicated data relationships. So can you talk a little more about those two approaches? Am I wrong in thinking they're kind of different, or do they complement one another? And what does jumping straight on the technology curve look like for a federal agency?
So I think that if you go back to the sort of opening where I sort of asked you guys to think about what you think modern software looks like, modern software probably looks like a collection of services, maybe microservices that all run in a highly distributed cluster of commodity servers. So if you could take if you decide the business logic that exists in an old monolithic legacy system, if that business logic is reusable, then the challenge becomes, how do you break a giant monolithic thing into lots of little services? So that might be one approach. But I guess what I believe is that we're getting to the point where the amount of effort to take 30-year-old software and migrate it into a modern environment, the amount of effort to do that is equal to or greater than the amount of effort to just sort of get your head wrapped around the business rules that are encoded in that monolith and just rewrite from scratch. So a year and a half ago, I probably thought that we could solve this problem through incremental migration, and now I'm pretty much of the opinion that what we need to do is understand the business rules and the business process that's embedded in these legacy systems and just rewrite.
Another question?
This is Amit Singh from Jefferies in New York. A quick question on workforce. You talked a lot about, during this panel, a lot of work being done on modernization, cybersecurity, and of course there's a lack of talent over there, and you also spoke about a lot of people sort of retiring in the next few years. Do you think it makes more sense to start maybe outsourcing a lot of this work to a lot of services firms which are in the Beltway, more than what government has done previously?
You want me to start?
So it's interesting. I mentioned we have one very modern project going on where we're doing Node.js and cloud and a bunch of stuff that I think is fairly advanced. And I will say that SSA is probably a little bit different than most of the other government agencies in that we still do about 75% of the work with federal employees, and only about 25% of our workforce is contractors. But in this particular project, what I'm doing is spending, $250 an hour to bring contractors in and teach them to do modern stuff. I mean, I don't need to do that. I could teach my own guys to do modern stuff. I don't find the contractors in the Beltway to have giant expertise in Node.js and cloud and stuff like that, because where do you guys get your expertise? By working for us, and what we do is work in a legacy environment. So what we're doing at SSA, which we're actually really excited about, is we're acquiring a coding boot camp. If you go Google on it, you'll find thousands of hits that sort of emerged out of Silicon Valley. And if you think about if you were going to go learn French, you could go buy a CD and study it for an hour a day. But what people will tell you, if you really want to learn French, go into an immersion program where you spend 90 days and you're not allowed to do anything but speak French, and you'll come out able to speak it. So what we're going to do is immerse people in a 90-day boot camp where they're going to learn Agile and continuous integration and Jenkins and Node.js and Java and Git and all of these things, that we're just going to immerse them, and we're going to try to transform our existing workforce to be the kind of people that can go do this modern stuff for us.
Any other questions? Well, let me follow up. In a DoD environment, workforce transformation, mm-hmm. Is that something that's possible over there?
So we have put concerted effort into doing that. So specifically,
you have a different kind of boot camp in DoD.
Right. But we've had a lot of flexibility in being able to hire new technologists specifically focused on cyber and security. So fortunately, I think just a couple weeks ago, we had a cyber job fair up at Fort Meade. So we've been able to look at internship programs, SCEP and STEP programs for students to be able to bring in those fresher ideas, younger workforce. We have a dedicated group that looks at hiring, how we do that, how we expand it, how we bring in the new blood. We also, to your question about industry, we're getting ready to put very large contracts on the street that will be outsourced. Our computing environment, our MilCloud 2.0, DEE 2.0. Some of DISA's very largest capabilities will be on the street that will be outsourced. Government oversight, contractor run on-premise in a DoD facility. So I think we're doing all those things, maybe not at the speed people would like necessarily, but again, we've got to think about cyber implications. We've got to think about the needs of the department and the requirements of the department. But absolutely, we're going that direction to bring in industry-based experts and then some of the newer talent, both from industry and from universities.
And then the other big question that's always out there is how do we bring in new kinds of companies to do contracting? I know there's the DI/UX effort at DoD. There's different things on the table. What are you seeing? Maybe Richard. To try to bring in companies that maybe don't have a ton of government experience but have some of the technical chops that you want?
We're making an attempt at DOT, we're trying to find the balance point between feds and contractors. We got a pretty contractor heavy, and we've actually been trying to balance that out. But as far as balancing that out as it relates to workforce, is when I came and found it out of balance and asked why is it that way, they said, well, one of the reasons is we need people, we need these people with these skills, and the federal government, we don't do a very good job of training our folks or investing in them and investing in their technical education. And I thought, well, that's a shame. We should change that. We should, if we're going to attract bright folks, energetic, skilled folks to be a part of the federal workforce, we need to, show them that we're willing to invest in them and invest in their technical skill sets. And so I've been trying to work on that at DOT to try to strengthen the federal workforce as well as train them, and then try to bring it into balance with the contractors. I don't really have any trouble finding, the skill sets in the contractor community. I'm just trying to match speeds with that. And then I think, a good workforce, then it all rubs off on everybody. There's an interaction that takes place, and I would like to think that one of the things you look for in a contractor is when those folks come in, a willingness to do sharing, and teach people how to fish, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and maybe your last thoughts, Rob, on bringing in innovative companies.
So, the whole government contracting rules and regulations and FAR has been it's been an interesting thing from an outside guy to have to come into that world. But I know that the 18F folks are trying very hard to come up with creative ways to create vehicles that will allow small boutique high-tech companies into the system to offer up the kind of more advanced technology kinds of capabilities that I think that we're looking for. I do think that this problem sort of starts to solve itself, if to go back and plug for the modernization fund again, if we start modernizing, and we start spending billions of dollars, and we start building modern systems with our contractors, it's not going to take very many years before there's a giant pool of people that know how to do this stuff in a modern way, and it all starts to even out, and we can then go get contractors that can do modern stuff. We're only a couple of years away from it if we just get this $1 billion injection to start the process, I think.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to...
have one more question. We were talking about federal education of, keeping their technology accurate. Has there been any thought in well, let me just say, the ITEP program is going to sunset in 2018. Is there any thought that maybe voices from CIOs can allow that to extend? The ITEP program is an IT exchange program where federal employees can go to industry and learn and train. It's kind of like the education with industry, that sunset, and then they had ITEP, and it's bi-directional. Industry can come into DOD and work, and federal employees can go out to industry and work. You're still the same member of where you were, but that's due to sunset in 2 years. And so is there any thought that those programs that allow federal education to go to Silicon Graphics, I know SecDef is opening up an office there for new ideas. How is that being supported? And I bet a lot of people don't even know these programs exist. So how are you making them available to your workforce?
So I know Mr. Halverson, the DoD CIO, is making that a priority. We were actually here for the DISA Cyber Symposium about a month ago, and that was one of the key takeaways from his kind of fireside chat we had, and doing exactly that, expanding the program. It is a SecDef initiative. He's very much bought into that. We at DISA also are looking at that, and I've started to see traffic on how we're going to execute those plans. So from a DoD perspective, I believe they are on board. The question is the how to expand it, but yes, it's absolutely something we're looking at, and thank you for bringing up the Silicon Valley. I think that's a great thing the DoD has done to open up an office out there to engage with the technology experts out on the West Coast.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I think we're out of time. Well, you want to do one? We can do one quick answer.
Well, I just wanted to say, one of the things is we've built, we've been building some stuff over the last year, and the digital services team that's at OMB, not only have they've been helpful to come in and not do the work for us, but we've had several projects where they came in when we were done and looked at it with us and sort of did a kick the tires kind of approach. And there's been a great exchange of information between this digital team and our team, and exchange of ideas about how you tackle certain aspects of this modern development. So again, I think it's all those places where we exchange ideas is very important.
Okay.
Good question.
Well, thanks so much to our panelists for a great discussion, and to everybody who came and who asked questions. I got a final bit of housekeeping. The classroom sessions, which are CPE eligible, begin upstairs in the classrooms now. Washington Technology Industry Day sessions also begin upstairs now in room 152. That's a chance to interact with agencies that are putting stuff out on the street. And then the expo floor remains open until 4 p.m. And we hope to see you tomorrow, when our opening keynote presentation will be Endeavor to Succeed with former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and Captain Mark Kelly at 8:30 a.m. right here in the keynote theater. So a big round for our panelists. Really appreciate coming, and thanks very much.